Hello, sleepy travelers. Ready for a quiet history tale? Welcome to ASMR History. Let us drift through time. Close your eyes. One day in the Middle Ages, survival is the only luxury. To find that unbreakable rule of history, the one that ties the powerful to the powerless, our journey must begin not in a gilded palace, but in the cold, unforgiving mud. We must start with the most fundamental lie of all the romanticized tale of the Middle Ages. Forget the Hollywood pageantry of chivalry and castles. The truth is far more intimate and infinitely more brutal. Congratulations. The year is 1325. The church bell is your merciless alarm clock, and the fleas in your straw mattress are already awake. The good news is you're alive. The bad news is that your life is a relentless assault on the senses, and the day has only just begun. You blink open your eyes, not to the soft light of dawn filtering through a glass window, but to the murky gloom of a one-room wooden hut. The air you breathe is a thick cocktail of odors. The damp earth of the floor, the stale sweat of the 5 other family members sleeping beside you, the sharp tang of the goat that shares your living space, and a creeping, musty scent you pray isn't mold. But know in your soul, it is. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they had, they would only melt into the dirt. Your bed is not a bed. It is a pile of half-rotted straw, a universe of biting insects and hay that smells precisely like the barn floor it was 3 months ago. The only blanket is a slab of coarse, unwashed wool so heavy with the accumulated grime of a long winter that it feels like a live animal pressing down on you. You try to stretch, but a jolt of pain seizes your joints. You are 22 years old, but in the grim calculus of medieval life, you are effectively middle-aged. Your spine cracks and groans like the old wooden door of the hut, and your knees grind with the sound of a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Every morning is a gamble. As you swing your legs over the side of your straw pile, your bare feet meet the floor. Will it be slick with the rain that leaked through the thatched roof last night, or crusty with something the neighbor's chicken left behind? Either way, you are now part of the ecosystem. And privacy. The concept is so alien, it might as well be heresy. Your entire family, parents, siblings, and perhaps a random cousin who simply never left, is waking up within arm's reach. There are no bedrooms, no curtains, no concept of me time. There is only the suffocating, inescapable reality of communal everything. You are never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and a half-dozen other people are your constant companions. This is morning in medieval Europe, and this is just the beginning. The day only gets worse from here. You've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. Now, nature calls. And it isn't a polite request. It's a desperate, screaming demand. This is the moment you would begin to miss the modern bathroom if you could even conceive of such a thing. There is no toilet, no seat, no paper, no flush. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a public spectacle. As a peasant, your bathroom is a wooden bucket behind the hut, which is of course already full. Your Uncle Wolfstown, it seems, had a rough night after gambling on some questionable turnips. The smell is biblical, an Old Testament plague visited upon your nostrils. You hold your breath, do your business as quickly as possible, and then comes the grand finale. You toss the contents into the street. Yes, the street. If you're considerate, you're supposed to shout a warning, something like Gardez-vous, a mangled version of the Old French for watch out for the water before dumping the bucket from a window or doorway. But frankly, no one ever moves fast enough. The streets of medieval towns are not charming cobblestone lanes. They are open sewers, sluggish rivers of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you would rather not identify. Walking through them is a perilous game of hopscotch, where every puddle is a potential source of disease. If you happen to live in a larger town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with a dozen strangers in a drafty outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might make small talk about the weather or the price of barley, but you try not to breathe too deeply. And toilet paper, never heard of it. Most people make do with whatever is at hand, a handful of straw, some leaves, a scrap of moss, Or if they're feeling particularly indulgent, a piece of old wool. Sometimes they use nothing at all, which might explain why the handshake had yet to become a popular greeting. You might think life in a castle offers a more dignified experience. It's better, but only marginally. A castle might feature a garderobe, which is essentially a stone closet with a hole in the floor that drops your waist directly into the moat below. It's a clever idea, except your enemies know all about it. Attackers have been known to climb up through these waste chutes to infiltrate a castle's defenses. Talk about entering through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron medieval toileting is a ritual of humiliation. It's cold, it's public, it's unsanitary, and it's dangerous. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in the collected leftovers of humanity. And you still haven't brushed your teeth. You've survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Perhaps a nice warm breakfast to start the day. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a grim, joyless affair. There are no eggs. Benedict, no coffee machines sputtering to life, and certainly no avocado toast. You squat near the smoldering fire and are handed a wooden bowl filled with something that looks like it was scraped off the bottom of a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. Pottage is less a recipe and more an ongoing edible experiment. It is a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever grains and root vegetables could be found, oats, barley turnips, and maybe a few beans if the harvest was good. This concoction has been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes even weeks. New ingredients are simply dumped on top of the old ones, creating a layered tapestry of flavors that range from bland to vaguely sour. On the side, you get a hunk of bread. But this isn't a fluffy artisanal loaf. It's a dense, dark brick made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust ground acorns or other creative fillers, because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This bread is so hard it could deflect an arrow. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it gnawing off chunks and hoping not to break a tooth. What about something to drink? You're not sipping fresh orange juice or an oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer at 6 o'clock in the morning. Even the children are drinking it. This isn't for recreation, it's for survival. The local water drawn from the same rivers that serve as sewers is teeming with parasites and bacteria. Brewing, however, involves boiling the water, which kills most of the deadly microbes. The result is small beer, a weak low-alcohol ale that won't get you drunk, but crucially won't kill you immediately. It's hydration with a high rate of survivability. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for special occasions, like saints' feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants might eat meat only a few times a year. Fresh fruit is available only when it's in season, and it's usually fermented into cider or wine before it has a chance to be eaten. And don't even think about spices. A tiny pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is so valuable it's often locked away. So you chew your gritty, sawdust-filled bread gulp down your lukewarm medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled on your pottage during the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it just happens to you. So what would you miss more coffee or cheese? Drop a comment below and let us know your modern-day essential. And if you're finding this glimpse into the past fascinating, don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next is even more unbelievable. Now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. Before heading to the fields, you must get dressed, not that it will provide much comfort. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. 1. It is a rough, scratchy tunic made of wool, or perhaps a linen shift if you're slightly better off. You have worn this same garment every day for months, possibly years. There is no such thing as seasonal fashion. There is only wear this until it disintegrates or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear is optional and rare. For most, it's just the coarse, sweaty wool directly against your skin, stitched together by someone who likely had no idea what a proper seam was supposed to look like. There is no washing machine, no soap as we know it, and certainly no dry cleaner. Your clothes are stiff with dirt stained with food and scented like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, the process is a day's labor in itself. You would have to haul water from a river, or heat it over a precious fire scrub your tunic on a wooden board with lye or ashes, and then hang it to dry in the sun, which in a place like England is out for approximately 3 days a year. Most of the time, your clothes are simply damp. And shoes, if you own any, they are crude shapes of untreated leather, barely stitched together, offering as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants simply go barefoot, their feet calloused and tough from navigating a world of mud dung and medieval landmines, otherwise known as sharp rocks and puddles of disease. All of this means one thing: your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Your body is a walking ecosystem, a mobile home for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. And everyone has them. Itchy nobles, lousy monks scratching children. The entire society is a collection of walking insect farms. You might find yourself scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while having a serious conversation with the local priest, and no one would even bat an eye. It's just a fact of life. Your skin is raw from rubbing your scalp, a battlefield of bites. If you develop a rash, well, too bad. There is no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone cream, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just keep on suffering. If you're lucky enough not to get an infection, that rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it's time to flash that morning smile. Except you don't, because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game, not emotionally, but dentally. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not very. There is no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no floss. Some people might chew on a twig to scrape their teeth or rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar. But for the most part, your teeth are on their own, and they are not doing well. By the time you reach your mid-20s, your mouth is a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen and bleeding, and the stains on your teeth aren't just from food. They are the slow creeping march of decay. Toothaches are like the medieval weather, always there, a constant dull throb in the background. It's the kind of persistent pain that makes you consider praying getting drunk or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke. That was the actual treatment. Dentists didn't exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same man who cuts your hair is also the one who will pull your molars out by candlelight using an iron hook and zero anesthesia. If that infected tooth abscesses, you just have to hope you don't get a fever. Without antibiotics, a simple tooth infection can easily turn into sepsis, killing you from something that today would send you to a pharmacy for a week's worth of pills. Kissing, good luck. Halitosis is universal. Your social standing isn't judged by your smile, but by your land and your livestock. Your mouth is a battlefield, and it is losing the war. With your teeth throbbing, it's time to head to work. Except there is no office, no desk, and certainly no chance of promotion. If you are like 90% of the population, your job is simple. Don't die while performing back-breaking labor for someone else's comfort. You are a peasant, a serf bound to the land. You work the fields that belong to a lord who probably doesn't know your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools are a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. There is no weekend, no clocking out. There is only sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Sunday is supposedly a day of rest, but only if you're not in the middle of a harvest, or fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for the infected toe you stubbed last week to stop turning black. The work is brutal. You plow fields by hand or with oxen if your village is wealthy enough to afford one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one asks about your mental health. If you are a woman, you get to do all the field work plus care for the children, cook, clean, spin wool, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the shared straw bed. Children begin their life of labor around the age of 5. There is no school, only a tiny wooden rake, and the dream of one day not dying of the flu. The pay for this life of servitude is basically survival. The perks are occasional bleeding. If you break a bone, too bad. You drink some warm beer and keep going, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, medieval Europe has a simple solution for that: you are replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. Let's talk about medicine, a field that was less about healing and more about surviving the cure. The so-called science of the day was rooted in the theory of the four humors. Your body wasn't seen as a complex biological machine, but as a vessel containing four liquids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every illness, from a nagging cough to the creeping plague, was diagnosed as a simple matter of these humors being out of balance. A persistent cough, too much phlegm, a cold and moist affliction, a feverish, angry disposition, clearly an excess of blood, which was hot and moist. The physician, often a monk with a rudimentary knowledge of ancient texts, approached your body like a cook trying to balance a precarious internal soup. And their favorite method of rebalancing was almost invariably subtraction. The answer to most ailments was bloodletting. The barber surgeon would arrive not with sterilized equipment, but with a simple blade or a box of hungry leeches. You would watch as your own life forced the very substance they believed you had too much of drained into a bowl, leaving you weaker and more vulnerable than before. All this was done in the name of restoring equilibrium. Justice in this era was less about protection and more about performance art. The legal system was a terrifying lottery. Imagine being accused of theft by a jealous neighbor. Your only path to proving your innocence might be the trial by ordeal. The local priest would declare that a benevolent God would never allow an innocent person to be harmed. Then you would be forced to plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Your scalded arm would be bandaged and sealed with the priest's mark. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed in front of the entire village. If the wound was festering and infected, which in a world without any concept of sterilization was almost guaranteed, you were pronounced guilty and punished accordingly. If by some miracle it had begun to heal cleanly, you were innocent. It was a divine no-win situation, a system where the verdict was delivered not by evidence, but by the capricious nature of infection. Lesser crimes were met with public humiliation designed to enforce social order. A baker who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the village with the deficient loaf tied around his neck. A woman accused of gossiping might be forced to wear the scold's bridle, a cruel iron mask, with a plate that pressed down on the tongue, making speech impossible. These weren't just punishments. They were public spectacles, a form of grim entertainment that reminded everyone of their place. After a long day of labor lice and leeches, as the sun finally sets, you shuffle back to your hovel, your stomach growling. It's time for dinner, the bad news. Your meal is pottage. Again. It's the same stew from this morning, perhaps, with a few new turnips thrown in. Every bite is a risk, but you eat anyway. Because in this world, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. And just when you think the day is over, you remember that God is watching. And so is the priest. And so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely report you if you miss Mass. Religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. The church controls everything: your calendar, your laws, your very thoughts. Every action is judged. Eat meat on a Friday, a sin. Think about your neighbor's wife, a double sin. And hell is vividly, terrifyingly real. The final act of your day is collapsing back onto the same pile of bug-infested straw where you began. You have survived. That is the only victory the day offers. You close your eyes, the aches in your body, a dull, constant rhythm, the stench of the hut, a familiar lullaby. But as you drift into a shallow, fitful sleep, a sound cuts through the night. It's not the cry of a wolf or the grunt of a neighbor's pig. It is a human scream from deep within the Lord's woods, sharp, terrified, and then abruptly silenced. It is a sound of a different kind of trouble, a kind that belongs to a world of power secrets and intrigue far removed from the simple brutality of your own. The Empress's Gambit. How a German princess forged an empire. But the screams of the powerless are often the background music for the games of the powerful. While one world was defined by the struggle against filth and famine, another, just beyond the forest's edge, was defined by a far more elegant, yet no less lethal game of survival against ambition. In this world, poisons were served in gilded cups, and daggers were hidden in diplomatic smiles. It was into this world that the unbreakable rule of history sent its next player. While peasants prayed for bread, a 14-year-old German princess named Sophie arrived at the Russian court with a chillingly simple mandate from her mother: seduce an heir, seize a crown, or be forgotten by history. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was a daughter of minor nobility from a tiny, insignificant German duchy. She possessed no great dowry and no powerful armies, but she had two assets that would prove far more valuable: a razor-sharp intellect and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her mother, Johanna, was a cold and calculating social climber who saw her daughter as a chess piece to be moved across the political board of Europe. Sophie was that piece dispatched in 1744 to the freezing, opulent capital of St. Petersburg. Her mission was to marry the heir to the Russian throne, the Grand Duke Peter. The reigning monarch Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, a formidable and deeply pious ruler, had specifically sought a pliable foreign bride, someone who would be grateful for the elevation and easy to control. On the surface, Sophie was the perfect candidate. But from the moment she stepped onto Russian soil, wearing thin German fabrics that offered little protection against the brutal winter, she had her own game in mind. She understood immediately that to survive in this viper's nest, she could not remain a German princess. She had to become more Russian than the Russians themselves. It was a calculated act of cultural assimilation that bordered on total immersion. With fierce determination, she dedicated herself to this transformation. She stayed up late into the night, her breath fogging in the cold air of her chambers, memorizing Russian vocabulary until her tongue no longer stumbled on the harsh Slavic consonants. She didn't just learn the language, she sought to understand the Russian soul, its deep-seated piety, its fierce patriotism, and its suspicion of outsiders. She studied the complex rituals of the Orthodox faith, not as a chore, but as a weapon, knowing that winning the clergy's approval was paramount. Her devotion was so intense that she contracted a severe case of pneumonia, bringing her close to death. Yet even this became a strategic victory. As she lay feverish, her own Lutheran pastor was denied entry to her chambers. Instead, she called for the Orthodox priest, a move that won the profound admiration of the court and the empress herself. In a grand public ceremony, she renounced her Lutheran faith and was reborn as Yekaterina Alexeyevna, a name that would one day be shortened to Catherine. In that moment, she wasn't just changing her name. She was burning the bridge behind her. There was no going back. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to be the culmination of this journey, the securing of her place in the line of succession. Instead, it became her gilded cage. Peter was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. He was an awkward, immature man-child, deeply insecure and resentful of the Russian court that had adopted him. He was a German prince who never stopped being German. He idolized Prussia and its warrior king Frederick the Great, and saw Russian traditions as barbaric. While Catherine diligently studied Russian history and courted the favor of powerful nobles, Peter played with toy soldiers in his chambers, drilling them for hours on end, and sometimes forcing his servants and his wife to participate in his elaborate war games. He was a heavy drinker prone to cruel jokes and childish tantrums. He was far more interested in his miniature armies and his German Holstein Guard than in governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. The marriage, by most accounts, went unconsummated for years, leaving Catherine in a precarious and humiliating position. She was a wife without a husband's favor, and a Grand Duchess without the guarantee of producing an heir, her primary function. Peter made his disdain for her clear, openly flaunting his mistress Elizaveta Vorontsova, and often humiliating Catherine at public functions. This mismatch was not just emotional, it was deeply political. The Russian court was a labyrinth of paranoia and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline, and every faction, the old nobility, the powerful clergy, the ambitious military commanders, was quietly maneuvering for the inevitable transition of power. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters were intercepted and read by the Empress's spies. Her friendships were monitored, her every move scrutinized. She was an outsider, a foreigner whose German origins made her permanently suspect. In this world of shifting allegiances, she could trust no one, not her erratic husband, not her scheming mother, who continued to whisper foreign interests in her ear, and certainly not the servants who reported her every word to their patrons. She was politically isolated, emotionally starved, and acutely aware that a single misstep could lead to her being repudiated and sent to a remote convent for the rest of her life. But Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's games with quiet brilliance. Publicly, she cultivated an image of dignity, piety, and patient endurance, a stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and his open contempt for all things Russian. She was the dutiful wife, the perfect consort, the silent observer. But behind closed doors, a different Catherine was emerging. She began a secret, voracious education, devouring the works of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. These books, often considered subversive and banned in autocratic regimes, had to be smuggled into the palace. By candlelight, she read the forbidden words of Voltaire and Montesquieu philosophers, who spoke of reason, progress, natural law, and the responsibilities of a monarch. This was more than a hobby. It was an act of rebellion. While Peter played with his toys, Catherine was building a blueprint for an empire. She was not just thinking of survival anymore. She was thinking of rule. She saw a future for Russia, not as the backward nation Peter disdained, but as a modern European power built on strength, education, and reason. And she began to believe that she, not her husband, was the one destined to lead it. To do so, she needed allies. Quietly, carefully, she began to cultivate them. She charmed influential military officers with her intelligence and grace, discussing strategy and history with a depth that impressed them. She befriended scholars and members of the Academy of Sciences, positioning herself as a patron of Russian culture. And most importantly, she found a passionate and ambitious supporter in a handsome young guards officer named Grigory Orlov. Their affair was not merely one of passion, it was a political merger. Orlov was charismatic, decisive, and fiercely loyal to her. He and his 4 powerful brothers held significant influence within the elite guard regiments stationed in the capital. They became the core of a growing faction, loyal to Catherine. The exact nature of their whispered promises in the shadowy corridors of the Winter Palace remains a mystery, a conspiracy veiled in courtly etiquette. But their goal was clear. They were not waiting for the throne to be inherited. They were planning for it to be taken. For nearly 2 decades, Catherine waited, watched, and planned a prisoner in a loveless marriage, a powerless wife, to a man universally regarded as unfit to rule. In 1762, her moment finally came. Empress Elizabeth died, and her husband became Tsar Peter III. His reign began unraveling almost immediately. In just 6 disastrous months, Peter managed to alienate every powerful institution in Russia. He insulted the Orthodox clergy by attempting to force them to shave their beards and adopt Lutheran-style vestments. He offended the nobility by showering favors upon his German relatives. And most egregiously, he insulted the army, the very bedrock of the Tsar's power. Having just fought a bitter war against Prussia, the Russian army was ordered by their new Tsar to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drills a deep humiliation. He openly praised Frederick, the Great Russia's longtime enemy, and ended the war on terms that were seen as a betrayal of Russian sacrifice. To cap it all off, he talked openly of divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with officers loyal to Catherine, began to grumble in the barracks. Watching all of this unfold, Catherine knew it was time to act. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at one of his summer palaces, she launched her bloodless coup d'état. It was a masterpiece of audacity and precision. In the pre-dawn hours, she was summoned from her bed by one of the Orlov brothers. She rode through the streets of St. Petersburg in the full uniform of an officer of the guards, a powerful symbolic gesture. She went directly to the barracks of the powerful imperial guard regiments. The tension was immense. A single loyal regiment could have arrested her on the spot. But when the soldiers saw her, a roar of allegiance went up. They had chosen their ruler, proclaimed Empress Catherine II, the sole ruler of Russia. She then proceeded to the Kazan Cathedral, where the clergy officially blessed her ascension. Caught completely off guard and with no allies to defend him, Peter III surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The official report, a document of breathtaking cynicism, declared that the former Tsar had died of a severe case of hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, everyone knew he had been murdered, likely strangled by one of Orlov's associates. Catherine was now empress. Not by birth, not by marriage, but by sheer force of will, wit, and audacity. It was an unprecedented achievement. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim to the throne had seized power without a single battle. The tension of her long wait was finally released. She wore the crown. But a new tension immediately took its place. The lie about her husband's death hung over her reign like a shroud, an original sin that her enemies would never let her forget. She understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She had to prove she was more than a usurper. She had to become a visionary. And so began her great transformation. She threw herself into the work of governing, often working 15-hour days. She set out to be the enlightened monarch her philosophical mentors, Voltaire and Diderot, had written about. In 1767, she convened a legislative commission, an ambitious project intended to modernize and codify Russia's entire legal system. Her own instruction to the assembly, a document known as the Nakaz, was a radical manifesto for its time, speaking of equality before the law and the dangers of torture. It was a beautiful document, but it was being read in a nation built on the brutal foundation of serfdom. How can you speak of legal equality when millions of your subjects are owned like property? This was the central paradox of Catherine's reign. She was a pragmatist. While she corresponded with French philosophers, she knew she ruled a vast feudal empire. To keep the nobility loyal, the same nobles who had helped her seize power, she reaffirmed their control over their serfs, effectively deepening the institution she philosophically opposed. Simultaneously, she turned her gaze outward with an ambition that dwarfed that of her predecessors. She waged successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, framing them as a modern crusade to liberate Orthodox Christians, while strategically securing for Russia the coveted warm water ports on the Black Sea and conquering the strategic region of Crimea. In a series of ruthless diplomatic maneuvers, she participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the neighboring Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia and absorbing vast new territories into her empire. She was redrawing the map of Europe, transforming Russia from a distant backward nation into a formidable continental power. She was at the height of her power, the philosopher queen crafting a modern state. But just as she was consolidating her rule, turning her grand vision into reality, a ghost from her past rose to challenge her. One evening, as she reviewed state papers in her study at the Winter Palace, a messenger arrived, his face pale with urgency. He brought news from the distant Volga River region, a report so outlandish it seemed impossible. A charismatic Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev was gathering a massive army of peasant serfs and miners. He was promising an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and freedom from the nobles. And he was doing it all in the name of the one person who could threaten Catherine's very legitimacy. Pugachev was claiming to be none other than her murdered husband, Tsar Peter III, miraculously saved from his assassins, and returned to reclaim his throne from the German usurper. The Crimson Queen, a 300-year-old secret, written in blood and jade. But some rulers aren't challenged by ghosts. They become them their stories sealed in stone, waiting for centuries in the patient silence of the earth. While Catherine the Great fought to write her own legacy in the annals of European history, halfway across the world, a team of archaeologists was about to uncover a queen whose legacy was written not in ink, but in poison and silence. In 1994, deep in the humid emerald labyrinth of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of the ancient Maya city of Palenque whispered their secrets to the stifling air. Here, in a landscape suffocated by the cacophony of unseen birds and the guttural roar of howler monkeys' towering limestone temples rise from the jungle floor, like the bones of sleeping giants. For decades, the site had been dominated by the magnificent Temple of the Inscriptions, the final resting place of the city's most famous ruler, Kiinich Janab Pakal, or Pakal the Great. But that year, a team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, turned their attention to a more modest adjacent structure, Temple the Throned. It was a smaller pyramid, long overlooked its surface, tangled in roots and vines, and not expected to hold much of significance. It was considered a secondary structure, a footnote to the grand narrative of its famous neighbor. The work was slow and arduous, a battle against heat humidity and the relentless encroachment of the jungle. As the team carefully surveyed the structure, painstakingly brushing away centuries of debris, they noticed an anomaly, a section of the temple floor that seemed different hollow. With a surge of adrenaline, they began to excavate. Beneath the stone flags, they discovered what they had hardly dared to hope for: a hidden, sealed chamber, a space that had been deliberately concealed from the world. Hope and tension mounted to an almost unbearable degree. In a region plagued by looters for centuries, the possibility of finding an untouched royal tomb, a pristine window into the past, was the dream of a lifetime. When they finally broke through the final barrier of stone and mortar and lowered a light into the darkness, the beam fell upon a stone sarcophagus resting in a silence that was 300 years deep. The air that rushed out was not the smell of decay, but of something else entirely. The dry mineral scent of the underworld mixed with the faint, sweet perfume of long-dead offerings. It was the smell of time itself. As the team carefully positioned their levers and lifted the massive stone lid, a cloud of brilliant, shocking red dust exploded into the air, billowing out like a crimson ghost released from its prison, staining the torchlight and catching in their throats. When the dust settled, the sight before them was breathtaking, an image of sacred, macabre beauty. The entire interior of the sarcophagus and everything within it was coated in a thick, uniform layer of bright red powder. Lying in this crimson shroud was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with immense care and reverence, a clear sign of her royal status. Her bones, though fragile, were remarkably intact. Her skull was adorned with a delicate funerary mask made of jade and obsidian fragments. Her body was surrounded by a wealth of offerings, heavy necklaces, intricate diadems, and wide ear spools, all crafted from precious green jade-white shell and polished bone. Everything about the burial screamed royalty, a person of the highest importance. And yet there was a profound and unsettling mystery. There was no name. No carved glyphs on the sarcophagus or the chamber walls identified her. It was one of the richest and most significant female burials ever found in the ancient Americas, and it was a complete enigma. The researchers, captivated by the stunning color that defined her burial, gave her a name, the Red Queen. The name stuck, but the questions only multiplied. Why was this powerful woman buried without her name being recorded? Who was she, a queen? A high priestess? Or perhaps, given the tomb's location, was she the wife of the great King Pakal himself? Even with the tools of modern forensics, the answers remained elusive. Her tomb, unlike most others, had been intentionally hidden, perfectly preserved, and purposefully isolated. Her burial was not just a funeral, it was a deeply spiritual and secret ritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the profound mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb, the element that set it apart from almost all others, was not the gleaming jade, but the ubiquitous red dust. A thick, heavy layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything: the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, and every offering placed around her. It clung to the stone like dried blood, a pigment both beautiful and deadly. To the ancient Maya, this was no mere decoration. It was a substance of immense spiritual power. Cinnabar, a mineral derived from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous materials in their world. Procuring such a quantity of pure cinnabar would have required extensive trade networks stretching across Mesoamerica, and a level of wealth reserved for the gods and the kings who walked among them. This wasn't just paint, it was power crystallized. Its vibrant red color was profoundly symbolic. It represented blood, the sacred life force that nourished the gods. It was the color of the rising sun in the east, the direction of birth and renewal. It was the color of sacrifice, the ultimate offering to maintain cosmic order. To cover the dead in Cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, to imbue it with the divine essence of life itself, preserving it not for a static eternity, but for a dynamic transition. In the complex cosmology of the Maya civilization, death was not an end. It was a perilous journey, a crossing from one cosmic layer to the next, into the fearsome underworld known as Xibalba. The Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for deification. But there is another, more sinister layer to this ritual. Cinnabar is highly toxic. Repeated exposure to mercury sulfide can lead to severe mercury poisoning, causing tremors, hallucinations, and eventually death. The Maya priests who handled this substance likely did not understand the chemistry, but they surely felt its potency. It was volatile, powerful, and inherently dangerous. To bathe a corpse in it was to declare that this person was no ordinary mortal. This was a being of such divine status that they could withstand, even in death, a substance that was lethal to the living. In the entire city of Palenque, only a handful of burials were graced with cinnabar. Crucially, the most prominent among them was King Pakal the Great. His body, like hers, was also found saturated in the sacred red powder. This detail alone became the cornerstone of speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal, if not greater, divine status? The clues went beyond the cinnabar. Her skull had been carefully placed upon what appeared to be the remains of a jaguar pelt, another symbol of royalty and shamanic power. Around her, an array of ritual objects hinted at her role in life. There were bone needles and obsidian blades tools, often associated with auto-sacrifice, the sacred act of bloodletting that Maya royalty performed to communicate with the gods. And among these tools was a single intricately carved bone needle, no longer than a finger, its head etched with a geometric pattern, whose meaning is now lost to time. It lay near her hand, as if ready for one final use. Was it a tool for weaving sacred textiles, an instrument for a specific ritual, or a personal item whose significance was known only to her? This small, silent object only deepened the enigma. Every part of her burial told a story without words. A story of immense power, cloaked in deliberate secrecy, of a woman being prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in a blaze of crimson ceremony. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains was a world of treasure, broken only by the cool green gleam of jade. These were not mere ornaments. They were as spiritual toolkit offerings, carefully chosen to accompany her on the perilous journey to Xibalba. At her sides were heavy jade necklaces, their polished surfaces still radiant after 300 years underground. For the Maya, jade was the ultimate symbol of life and eternity. Its green color represented maize, the crop that sustained their civilization, as well as the vibrant vitality of the jungle and the precious breath of the gods themselves. Only the highest elite, those with a direct connection to the divine, were buried with such quantities of jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she wielded immense influence and divine favor. One of the most haunting objects was the funerary mask placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of ancient Egypt, this one was a subtle mosaic constructed from dozens of tiny, masterfully cut tiles of jade, obsidian, and shell arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. This was not just a likeness, it was believed to be a conduit for the soul, a new permanent face for eternity. The mask served a critical ritual function to protect the soul on its journey to preserve the identity of the deceased, and to present her as a deified being in the eyes of the gods of the underworld. Scattered near her bones were ceramic vessels still sealed, which likely once held offerings of food and drink, perhaps a rich chocolate beverage, or a fermented maize drink to sustain her spirit on its long journey. These items weren't luxuries. In the Maya worldview, they were necessities for the afterlife. To modernize, the tomb feels intimate, not overloaded with treasure, but intentionally and powerfully curated. There was no gold, no chariots, no ostentatious pomp. There were only items chosen for their profound spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul, a testament to how the Maya understood death, not as an end, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't being buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void: her name. No inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone of immense power, but who was she? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began the detective work of connecting the dots. The most compelling theory, the one that fits the majority of the circumstantial evidence, is that the Red Queen was Tsakbu Ajau, the wife of King Pakal the Great. Tsakbu Ajash was more than just Pakal's consort. Born into the royal dynasty of Palank, she was a powerful figure in her own right. She was a dynastic linchpin, the mother of at least 2 sons, who would go on to rule, securing the succession of Palank for another generation. Inscriptions from elsewhere in the city depict her performing key ceremonial roles during her husband's long and prosperous reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. The strongest evidence supporting this theory is the tomb's location. Temple the Thend stands directly beside Pakal's own grand burial pyramid, the Temple of the Inscriptions. In a sacred city where every structure was cosmologically aligned, this proximity could not be a coincidence. It suggests a deliberate pairing husband and wife rulers united even in death. And then there is the cinnabar. The fact that only these 2 high-status burials in Palank were found with such an intense and complete covering of the sacred red powder strongly implies a direct and exclusive relationship. Here, however, the mystery deepens. In an attempt to solve the puzzle once and for all, scientists conducted DNA tests on the remains of both the Red Queen and Pakal's known descendants. The hope was that modern science would finally give a name to the woman in the red dust. The tension was palpable as the archaeological community awaited the results. The results, when they came back, were a stunning twist. They were inconclusive. The analysis showed no direct maternal link between the Red Queen and Pakal's line. This definitively ruled out the possibility that she was his powerful mother, Lady Sakkauk, who had herself ruled Palank as regent before him. But it did not rule out her being his wife, as they would not have shared maternal DNA. Science, the ultimate tool of certainty, had only returned a more profound question. It had not given them a name. It had only deepened the silence, shutting one door of inquiry, while leaving another tantalizingly ajar. Some have argued she could have been a high priestess of immense authority, or another royal relative whose name has simply been lost to the erosion of time. Still, the weight of the evidence, the location, the cinnabar, the sheer richness of the burial points most strongly to Tsakbu Ajas, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to one of the Maya's greatest rulers. The lack of a name may not be an oversight, but an intentional act. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through written words on a monument, but through ritual symbol and the living memory of the community. And so the Red Queen remains suspended between legend and truth, a woman who ruled remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it was a statement that some stories aren't meant to be read, but felt. But while this queen's story was sealed in silence, another woman centuries later, and in the heart of another great Mexican civilization, would choose to do the opposite. She would take her silent suffering and paint it across canvases for the entire world to see. The woman who painted her pain. Frida Kahlo's revolution in a broken body. But while this queen's story was sealed in silence, another woman centuries later, and in the heart of another great Mexican civilization, would choose to do the opposite. She would take her silent suffering and paint it across canvases for the entire world to see, creating a legacy not of mystery, but of brutal, vibrant honesty. On September 17, 1925, a wooden bus traveling through Mexico City collided with a streetcar. In the horrific splintering impact, an iron handrail broke loose, pierced the body of an 18-year-old girl, and pinned her to the wreckage. Her name was Frida Kahlo. She would later say this was the first of two great accidents in her life. The second, and by her own account the worst of the two, was her husband Diego Rivera. These two collisions, one of steel and one of the heart, would define her existence, shattering her body and her spirit. But in doing so, they would forge one of the most iconic and revolutionary artists of the 20th century. Before the accident, Frida was a force of nature. Born in 1907 in the Coyoacán district of Mexico City, in the vibrant blue house the Casa Azul that would become her lifelong sanctuary, she was imaginative, outspoken, and fiercely intelligent. The air of post-revolutionary Mexico was electric with new ideas, and Frida was at its epicenter. She was one of only a handful of girls accepted into the prestigious National Preparatory School, an institution that was the intellectual heart of a new nation trying to define itself. Her dream was not marriage or domesticity, but to become a doctor. She was a political firebrand, a core member of a rebellious intellectual group known as the Cachuchas, who wore matching caps and delighted in challenging the conservative traditions of their time. They debated Marxism, read forbidden literature, and planned intellectual pranks with Frida as one of their most charismatic and sharp-tongued members. Though a bout with polio at age 6 had left her with a withered right leg, a vulnerability she hid beneath long skirts, it never dampened her spirit. She was on a path to a life of the mind, a life of healing others, a life she believed she was in complete control of. The bus crash ended that path forever. The collision was a cataclysm of screeching metal and splintering wood. The iron handrail entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis, shredding her insides. Her spinal column was fractured in 3 places. Her right leg, already weakened by polio, was shattered in 11 places. Her collarbone ribs and pelvis were broken. Her shoulder was dislocated. In a final surreal detail that would seem almost prophetic of her future art, a fellow passenger's package of powdered gold burst open, dusting her bloody broken body in a glittering shroud. For a month, she lay in a hospital, her life hanging by a thread. For months after she was imprisoned in a series of torturous plaster corsets and steel contraptions, flat on her back, staring at a ceiling that became the entire world. The future she had imagined, the life of a doctor, dissolved into an endless present of agonizing, inescapable pain. She was no longer the one who would heal. She was the one who would be perpetually broken. But in that stillness, in that prison of plaster and pain, something began to stir. To combat the crushing boredom and the encroaching despair, her father Guillermo Kahlo himself, a photographer, gave her his box of paints. Her mother commissioned a special easel that could be rigged above her bed, allowing her to paint while lying down. And most importantly, she had a large mirror placed on the underside of the canopy. And there, with her body broken and her dreams in ashes, Frida Kahlo began to paint. Her first subject was the only one she had herself. As she would later famously state, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." This was not an act of vanity. It was an act of survival. The mirror did not just show her a face. It showed her a subject, a specimen to be dissected. The girl who had wanted to study medicine now began to study her own broken anatomy, her own suffering. Her early self-portraits are unflinching documents of her reality. She turned to the style of Mexican retablos, small devotional paintings on tin, that often depicted miracles or thanked saints for deliverance from disaster. But she turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, her pain, the subject of devotion. She didn't paint pretty landscapes. She painted a landscape of trauma. In one work, her body is pierced with dozens of nails, like a modern-day martyr. In another, the iconic The Broken Column, she depicts herself split open, her shattered spine replaced by a crumbling ionic column, her torso held together by a torturous-looking steel corset. Tears stream down her face, but through it all, her gaze is direct, defiant, and unnervingly calm. She is both the victim and the observer, the patient and the surgeon. The crash had broken her body, but it had given her a new language, a visual vocabulary of surreal, brutal honesty that would define her art. As she slowly recovered, able to walk again, albeit with a permanent limp and chronic pain, She was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist. In 1928, she sought out the opinion of Mexico's most famous painter, the monumental and famously volatile muralist Diego Rivera. He was a giant of a man, both in physical stature and artistic reputation, a living legend known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that celebrated the history of the Mexican people. Frida, then just 21, approached him with characteristic boldness while he was working high on a scaffold and bluntly asked him to judge her work. He recognized in her small, intense paintings something rare and powerful, an unfiltered voice raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, and a strange, terrible beauty. Their connection was immediate and explosive. They were, as she famously called them, the elephant and the dove. They married in 1929, embarking on one of the most passionate, creative, and destructive relationships in art history. Diego was the great love of her life, but he was also her second great accident. He believed in her genius and encouraged her art, seeing in her a talent that was entirely distinct from his own public-facing work. But he was also endlessly unfaithful, a compulsive womanizer whose betrayals were a constant source of torment for Frida, the emotional equivalent of her physical pain. The most devastating blow, a wound from which she never truly recovered, came when he had an affair with her own younger sister, Christina. The physical agony of the handrail was a known quantity. The emotional agony of this betrayal was a new, unmappable territory of pain. In response, Frida cut off her long, dark hair, which Diego had adored, and painted one of her most visceral and disturbing works, A Few Small Nips. The canvas depicts a murdered woman lying on a bed, bleeding from dozens of stab wounds, as a man stands over her, nonchalantly cleaning his knife. The scene is splattered with red paint, which Frida even allowed to drip onto the frame, blurring the line between the painted horror and the viewer's reality. In turn, Frida reclaimed her own autonomy through her own affairs with both men and women, including a rumored liaison with the exiled Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who lived with them for a time at the Casa Azul. They divorced in 1939, a period of intense loneliness and artistic productivity for Frida, only to remarry a year later. They were unable to live with each other, yet unable to live apart. Their second marriage was not a romantic reconciliation, but a pragmatic pact and understanding between two titanic forces who knew they needed each other, even if that need was a source of mutual destruction. Their bond was not one of conventional romance. It was a chaotic, symbiotic partnership built on mutual admiration, shared politics, and profound recurring pain. This emotional turmoil, layered on top of her chronic physical suffering, became the inexhaustible fuel for her art. While Rivera painted grand murals for the public chronicling revolutions and class struggle on a massive scale, Frida painted small, intensely personal canvases that were windows into her soul. Her work became an encyclopedia of symbols drawn from Mexican folklore, Aztec mythology, and Catholic iconography. Monkeys, which she kept as pets, appeared in her portraits as tender, protective surrogates for the children she could never have due to her injuries. Thorns wrapped around her neck, drawing blood, a symbol of the pain she endured from her love for Diego. Hummingbird symbols of good luck in Mexican tradition appeared dead on her chest, their lifelessness a poignant commentary on her own fate. In The Two Fridas, arguably her most famous masterpiece, she painted a double self-portrait, a portrait of her identity split between the woman Diego loved, dressed in traditional Tehuana attire with her heart whole, and the one he had abandoned, clad in a European dress with her heart exposed and bleeding. Her art was also fiercely political. As a committed communist, she used her work to critique colonialism, capitalism, and the patriarchy. Her very appearance became a political statement. In an era when many upper-class Mexicans emulated European styles, Frida deliberately embraced her indigenous roots. She adopted the traditional clothing of the women of Tehuantepec: long, colorful skirts, intricate embroidered blouses, and elaborate jewelry as a celebration of her Mexican heritage, or Mexicanidad, and a rejection of Eurocentric standards of beauty. Her home, the Casa Azul, became a living extension of this identity, a vibrant sanctuary filled with pre-Columbian artifacts. folk art, and revolutionary books, a place where she surrounded herself with the culture she so proudly represented in her work. Her unibrow, which she deliberately emphasized in her portraits, became a defiant statement against conventional femininity. In a world that wanted women to be ornamental, Frida chose to be a monument complex, flawed, and unapologetically herself. As the years wore on, her body continued to betray her. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, each one a new battle, each one leaving new scars. She was often bedridden for months, her body encased in steel and plaster corsets that she would turn into works of art themselves, painting them with butterflies and communist symbols. But still she painted. Her art became her defiance, her revolution. Her works grew darker, more surreal, but her gaze never wavered. The climax of this lifelong battle between her broken body and her unbreakable spirit came in 1953. By then, Frida's health was so fragile that her right leg had been amputated at the knee due to gangrene. She was largely confined to her bed, battling constant pain and infection. That year, she was finally given her first solo exhibition in her home country of Mexico. It was a long overdue honor, a recognition of her unique genius. But her doctors forbade her from attending. She was too ill, too weak to leave her bed. Frida, however, would not be denied. In a final spectacular act of defiance, she did what only Frida Kahlo would do. She arranged for an ambulance to take her to the gallery. As the doors of the exhibition opened and the crowd of artists, intellectuals, and admirers buzzed with anticipation, she was carried in on a stretcher and placed in the four-poster bed that had been set up in the middle of the gallery. Dressed in her traditional finery, adorned with jewelry with flowers in her hair, she held court from her bed, greeting friends with tequila, telling bawdy jokes and laughing with the same fiery spirit that had always defined her. She had turned her sickbed into a throne. It was a moment of absolute triumph, a declaration that even as her body was failing, her will was indomitable. Her final paintings were both harrowing and joyful. Her very last work was a still life of sliced watermelons, the vibrant red flesh, a symbol of life itself. On one of the slices, she wrote her final words to the world, "Viva la vida, long live life." On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same blue house where she had been born. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but many believed she had finally succumbed to the cumulative weight of her pain. Her last diary entry, written just days before, was brief and piercing. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." The ambiguity of that final wish, a desire for a joyful end, but also a final weary refusal to endure the cycle of suffering any longer, is a haunting testament to the woman who lived at the extremes of pain and passion. Her life was a testament to the idea that our greatest wounds can also be the source of our greatest strength, and that true art is not about painting dreams, but about painting one's own unfiltered reality. Her final defiant message hangs in the air, a masterpiece of art and life, leaving her own story as the most powerful unresolved chord. The unbreakable thread of defiance. Her hope never to return hangs in the air, a final defiant masterpiece of art and life, leaving her own story as the most powerful unresolved chord. And it leaves us back where we started with a question that has echoed through each of these disparate lives. A question that ties the mud-soaked fields of the 14th century to the gilded halls of the Russian Empire, the silent tombs of the Maya, to the vibrant, pain-filled canvases of modern Mexico. So what is the unbreakable rule? The single unifying thread that connects a peasant in the mud, an empress on a throne, a queen in a tomb, and an artist in a body cast? The answer is not merely survival, for survival can be a passive state, a simple biological continuation. The unbreakable thread is something far more active, more potent, and more profoundly human. It is defiance. It is the stubborn, unyielding, and sometimes desperate refusal to be erased, whether by poverty, by political intrigue, by the silence of history, or by one's own broken body. It is the assertion of will against a world determined to crush it. Each of our four figures, separated by centuries and circumstance, embodies a unique facet of this fundamental human impulse. Consider the anonymous medieval peasant, the one you became at the start of our journey. Their defiance was not glorious, It was not recorded in any chronicle, celebrated in any song, or memorialized in stone. It was a gritty, animalistic defiance enacted every single day. To wake up in a cold, flea-infested hut to face a day of back-breaking labor on land you will never own, to eat food that is barely fit for consumption, and to know that your life is likely to be short, brutal, and forgotten, and to still get up and do it all over again, is an act of profound defiance. This wasn't just resilience. It was a quiet internal war waged every single moment against the crushing certainty that your life meant nothing to the world. To find a reason to chew that gritty bread, to lift that heavy hoe one more time, was to reject the verdict of your circumstances. This was not a legacy of stone, but one of footprints in the mud, each one a small but profound victory. It is the defiance of the body against a world that is actively trying to kill it through starvation, disease, and exhaustion. It is a rebellion waged not with swords, but with the simple, stubborn act of taking one more breath, planting one more seed, and enduring one more sunrise. This is the bedrock of the human spirit, the will to exist against all logic. Contrast this with the grand strategic defiance of Catherine the Great. Where the peasant's struggle was for physical survival, Catherine's was a high-stakes game for political survival, and ultimately for absolute power. She arrived in Russia as a foreign pawn, a young girl expected to be nothing more than a docile broodmare for the throne. She defied that expectation. Trapped in a humiliating marriage to a man who despised her, she defied the role of the victim. Her defiance was a meticulously constructed fortress of intellect. Every page of Voltaire or Montesquieu she consumed in secret was a stone laid in her defense against the court's expectations. She defied the intellectual vacancy expected of her, transforming her gilded cage into a university of power. Her coup d'etat was merely the final physical manifestation of a revolution that had already taken place in her mind. As a woman in a world ruthlessly dominated by men, she defied the notion that her gender made her unfit to rule, rejecting her assigned role and seizing a destiny she believed was rightfully hers. While the peasant defied misery, Catherine defied the very structures of power that were meant to keep her in her place. She proved that the most powerful empire can be conquered not just by armies, but by a superior idea held by a single determined individual. Her legacy was forged not by accepting her fate, but by rewriting it with an iron will. Then we travel deeper into the past, to the silent, enigmatic defiance of the Red Queen of Palenque. Her defiance is the most mysterious of all, for it is not her own, but the defiance of an entire civilization against the ultimate erasure, oblivion. In a world without written histories as we know them, how does a culture ensure that its great figures are not forgotten? The Maya of Palenque answered with ritual. The entombment of the Red Queen was a monumental act of spiritual defiance. This was a defiance rooted in faith and community. For the people of Palenque, allowing their queen to vanish into nameless dust would have been a catastrophic failure of their cosmic duty. They did not simply bury a body, they prepared a vessel for eternity. The layers of precious jade, the powerful symbolism of the jaguar pelt, and most importantly, the shroud of toxic blood-red cinnabar, were not just offerings for the afterlife. They were weapons against being forgotten. The cinnabar was their promise to the gods. The jade was their promise to her. By encasing her in the very color of life force and sacred power, her people were making a statement, attempting to lock her essence, her importance into the fabric of the cosmos itself. Hers is a defiance against the silence of history, a belief that even without a name, a legacy could be made permanent through the sheer force of ritual. It was an attempt to make a memory immortal. And finally, we arrive at Frida Kahlo, whose story brings the thread of defiance into the raw, personal territory of the modern soul. Her defiance was artistic, emotional, and deeply personal. After the bus crash shattered her body, the world expected her to be an invalid, a tragic figure defined by her suffering. She defied this narrative. Instead of hiding her brokenness, she placed it at the very center of her art. She took the steel corsets that imprisoned her and painted them onto canvases as symbols of her fractured reality. She took the emotional agony of Diego Rivera's betrayals and transformed it into a universal language of heartbreak and resilience. Her defiance was to refuse to suffer in silence or to present a sanitized version of her reality. With every self-portrait, with every unflinching gaze, with her celebrated unibrow and traditional Mexican attire, she defied the conventions of beauty, the expectations of women, and the notion that pain was something to be hidden. Frida's art is a testament to the defiance of the individual spirit, a declaration that one's greatest wounds can be transformed into one's most powerful voice, a soundbite of the soul that echoes to this day. So what does this unbreakable thread of defiance woven through these 4 lives tell us? It tells us that history is not just a collection of dates battles and the reigns of kings. That is merely the skeleton. The heart of history. The part that truly matters lies in these individual struggles against overwhelming circumstances. The true legacy of humanity is not found in the empires that were built, but in the will of the people who built them, suffered under them, and rebelled against them. It is found in the peasant who endured the empress who dared the queen who was sanctified, and the artist who revealed her soul. In the end, these stories hold up a mirror. They challenge us to look at our own lives and to recognize the echoes of these struggles within ourselves. We may not face the brutal reality of medieval serfdom or the political intrigue of an 18th century court, but we all face our own battles against circumstances that seem designed to diminish us. We face our own struggles for relevance, our own fights against being silenced, our own personal pains that threaten to define us. These 4 lives remind us that the human spirit is not defined by its suffering, but by its response to it. The most powerful force in history is not an army or a crown. It is the simple, defiant choice to endure, to create to lead, and to refuse to be forgotten. So think about this the next time you face a challenge that feels insurmountable. What form will your defiance take? Will it be the quiet endurance of the peasant, the strategic brilliance of the empress, the sacred preservation of the queen's people, or the creative alchemy of the artist? These stories are more than just history. They are a playbook for the human spirit, a reminder that your legacy is not defined by the obstacles you face, but by the courage with which you confront them. Look around at the world and at your own life. Where do you see the stories of defiance hidden in plain sight? That is where you will find the unbreakable thread.